This is the things that happens at the very end. I got 250 or something, I think. So, or
Let
almost.
me confirm with Elena, because she's been kind of running the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Okay, could everybody please take their seats? Well, good afternoon to all, and welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Robert Newland. I have the pleasure of serving as the Deputy Librarian of Congress for Institutional Advancement. You're sitting in our magnificent members' room, a room that I think Bob would have appreciated very much. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's event, announcing the gift of the Bob Adelman Photo Archive to the Library of Congress and honoring the life and work of this incredible photographer and artist. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here this afternoon, especially the members of Bob's family, his friends, and fellow artists who traveled from all over the country to join us here today. In particular, I want to welcome Bob's daughter, Samantha Ray, and his colleague, Stephen Watt, who collaborated with our staff to help create an event that Bob would be proud of. Our thanks, too, to Helena Zinkum and Erica White for bringing us all together today. Today's guest speakers are befitting an icon like Bob. You will hear from the Librarian of Congress, the Poet Laureate, an award-winning New York Times photographer, a legendary novelist and short story writer, and a renowned curator of photography. After the formal speaking program, there will be a brief question and answer session, and we will conclude with a reception where you can view some of the remarkable images from this archive. I also want to mention that today's program is being live streamed on YouTube and recorded for a webcast that will be available on the Library of Congress website. Before I turn it over to Dr. Hayden, I just want to say what good fortune it was for me to spend some time with Bob over the past several years. During one of his visits to the library, my partner and I had a small cocktail party at our home in his honor. At some point during the evening, Bob began examining the art on our walls, and he zeroed in on a small watercolor that was painted by Gloria Vanderbilt. And this led to the most remarkable, and I'm guessing undocumented story about this commission. Bob said that he rarely accepted portrait commissions, but he made an exception for Mrs. Vanderbilt. And he did the portrait at her home on Beekman Place, and it was really quite an extraordinary portrait. The press of time prevents me from recounting the whole story, so I'll just leave it as a very, very warm memory of Bob. And now it is my pleasure to welcome the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden.
Good afternoon, and it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today. I am pleased that the Library of Congress is now entrusted with the preservation and eventual exhibiting of the collection of the photography of Mr. Adelman. In his own words, life's work is about the many and the diverse social concerns in America: poverty, mental illness, alcoholism, inadequate housing, the immigrant experience. And as his collection so marvelously documents the struggle to overcome racial discrimination. And like so many other Americans, I was deeply moved by the photographs he took in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, when the police in Ingram Park used fire hoses to push back African Americans who demanded civil rights. It's especially significant as I am the first African American to lead the Library of Congress. As he said, the fire hosers were brutal. They ripped the bark from the trees. And nevertheless, the people held onto one another and were able to resist. The images, which I've learned since were used to promote the March on Washington, made me think about Dr. King and the message that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And I was personally struck by his own message that photography, and his photography, was not only, quote, intent on telling the truth, but doing something about it. And in his own words, it was a constant effort not only to document what I was seeing, but to figure out how to change things. Change, as we know, is a continuous struggle and demands constant effort and vigilance, which is why the Libraries Congress is so proud to preserve his work and collection for future generations. And thanks to the generosity of an anonymous donor, the library has acquired over 600,000 prints, negatives, slides, and other materials documenting not only the African American civil rights movement, but the many changes in American culture brought about by remarkable individuals like him. Sadly, he passed away last March, and I was not able to meet him. But I have heard many stories from staff members, and particularly Mr. Newland, who left out a little something. If you get him at the reception, he might tell you the true Gloria Vanderbilt story that she has actually mentioned too. He was a graduate of Rutgers University and Columbia University. He taught at the New School for Social Research and the School of Visual Arts, Stanford University, Ohio State University, and the University of Minnesota. He also worked at the International Center for Photography in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Massachusetts. His photography has been published by Time Magazine, Harper's Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, as well as Life, People, and Esquire. He also authored, edited, and illustrated over a dozen books, including Martin Luther King, A Celebration of Word and Image, Remembering Jack on President John F. Kennedy, and Out of Left Field, Willie Stargell and the Pittsburgh Pirates. And additionally, his photography was included in the book, This Light of Ours, Activist Photographers of the Civil Rights Movement. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and multiple Art Directors Club's honors. He won the University of Missouri School of Journalism Award, and his work was included in the American Institute of Graphic Arts' 50 Most Notable Books. And now we are honored that his collection will be preserved and exhibited by the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. And with the help of Deputy Librarian Robert Newland, it is now my honor to present the Library of Congress's latest acquisition and, in case you were wondering, to really unveil what's under this cloth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helena Zinkamp, Chief for the Prints and Photographs Division. Delighted at such a large turnout today. And I'm your moderator, so you'll see me coming up and down frequently. Juan Felipe Herrera, the Poet Laureate, has written a special poem in honor of Bob Adelman. Please.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And I want to thank the family, the Adelman family, for this moment that you have provided to me and everyone. Such a beautiful experience to see, to notice the photographs. And I was very moved when I looked at the various books that Bob put together and his photographs. It was something that made my life when I was a child as a migrant son. My mother had a small brownie, and it made her life most interesting and creative, and it gave us all something that we can still look at and return to and continue with. This is a partial American alphabet, a photo poem for Bob Adelman. Vincent and Danny run, stop, meditate inside a cardboard box somewhere in Brooklyn for a day. Bob Adelman follows and they play. They hide in the crevices, splash themselves on the concrete, hug and meander with a kite. I'm bigger than the Empire State Building, Danny says, smile, angelic. I don't want to be on your team, Vincent. B is for black, W is for white, I is for, I'm sorry I said that. J is for jealous. I am just a bum player. W is for when we are together, it is all right. Bricks and brambles, concrete and alone, gray and white and black and water and time, and something that splits us in half, then something that puts us back into one. S is for singing for the Congress of Racial Equality. S is for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. J is for Jim Crow, no more. In Adelman's lens, we see, we notice, we enter, we move. We are the people, even though we are far away inside the camera. Break away, break through, Adelman says. Break through, Adelman says. Break through for a moment, a half moment is enough to start getting free. F is for a ferry boat in Mississippi. O is for, there's plow in Alabama. And B is for B.B. King in Memphis. And C is for cooking and conking your hair to make it smooth in the white world. There's a young man, Amiri Baraka, in the Black Arts Movement, making revolution with words, with spoken hollers, with art that comes at you with a voice in a lens. Don't cover up your lens, says Adelman. Don't you cover up your lens, says Bob Adelman. Open it up until there is just breath, into all breath, so you can breathe into freedom. So you can breathe into freedom. M is for Malcolm X with an umbrella as the storm ahead unravels. T is for trucking cotton in Alabama. Can you see it, America? You got 1 minute to lay in the cotton. New machines, new screws, move the matter. M is for machines, and sometimes it is for madness. L is for Liechtenstein. Make sure every dot of your face is in the picture. Make sure your eye in its lush, flat encounters peers into you. M is for marching into Montgomery. T is for tenant farmers and its socialites. Socialites? Time for reflections in the lens. After you give your life in the fields, you vanish, but not in Adelman's black and white exposures. There's a proud woman, Miss Petway, with wallpapers and a wood-burning stove and Martin Luther King on her mind. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Q is for quilts and basket makers making changes, reed by reed, needle by needle, inspiration. J is for jug blowers and H is for horse show riders. Oh, yes, it is not as simple as you think. There's a way through to freedom. Yes, indeed. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. There's a way through to freedom. Baptisms in the water and James Brown all around. And it's for white nuns singing in Alabama. A is for America. I'm not leaving. I'm not going back to Jim Crow. F is for fire hose spray at Kelly Ingram Park. See it peel the bark off the trees while you hold on to each other, while you hold on in Adelman's camera. A is for Adelman as he holds you, as he holds onto you, into you, as you hold onto him in an f-stop of 550,000 exposures, not hidden, not on page 12, not silent, not invisible. A is for America. A is for Adelman. Put the alphabet together. Put freedom together. Everybody say freedom. Freedom. Everybody say Adelman. Adelman. Everybody say freedom again. Freedom. Not silent, not invisible. Put freedom together. S is for segregation, separation between you and yourself. I is for innocent while arrested. T is for 3 generations of tenant farmers. And S is for school, integration until you get too close. But you have to get close. Everyone say, you have to get close. You have to get close. That's what the camera's for. That's what the lens is for. And that's where we get respect. 3 generations of tenant farmers. You get too close, but you have to. You have to get close. C is for colored only. Remember El Paso, Texas, 1961, en route to Mexico City with my tia Lela and my mother Lucha. Which restroom? Where's brown? Brown is black, black is brown. R is for Rosa Parks, sitting on a bus, in the bus, not giving up her seat. W is for we shall not be moved. Everyone say, W is for we shall not be moved. And Adelman's camera is for lay down in front of the tractor. L is for lay down in front of the tractor so you can stop unfair labor practices at the Downstate Medical Center. Adelman keeps moving. Adelman keeps America moving in front of your eyes. H is for holding hands in times of trouble, like Mimi Feingold at a congregation in West Feliciana Parish in Louisiana. Oh, everyone say, oh, 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 is for out of so much pain, reality and truth and compassion and change come. Marching, everybody say marching. Come singing. Come hollering. Come resisting. Come talking. Come saying. Come speaking. Come on up to the front free with your git fiddle and march until race baiting disappears. Can you see it in the camera? M is for memorial services for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. M is for memorial services for Malcolm X. L is for LGBTQ parades. No more gay bashing. No more gay bashing. V is for Vietnam Wall, that you can pray and touch and consider all those that gave their lives for you, America. W is for women's liberation. Say it as the land explodes. Everyone say women's liberation. Women's liberation. Everyone say W is for women's liberation. Say it as the land explodes. And C is for civil rights. L is for let my civil rights go. C is for camera. Adelman's camera with an S for C, and a C for compassion action, and an L for love, and a Y for yes, it is possible, and an E, for it is the engine that moves us together with Danny and Vincent, walking down the concrete world, and W for what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Because you are in this picture. Because S is for saying grace at dinner in Sumter, South Carolina. And Z is for Zen monk meditating in Rochester, New York. And H is for humanity. Adelman's humanity, our humanity. It spells America. Thank you so much.
Remarkable, thank you. And as you visit the photographs or the books later this afternoon, I think you will see the whole alphabet coming to life visually. We have 3 other speakers this afternoon. I'll ask if you could come up on the stage and each take a chair. Beginning perhaps with Jim Estrin. There's some steps on the other side. I'm going to take care of all the introductions in one fell swoop, and then we can settle in to hear the talks. So Jim Estrin is a photographer himself who began working at the New York Times in the 1980s. He also founded the New York Times photography blog, which is called The Lens. So many echoes are going to go back and forth with your poem this afternoon. In 2014, actually earlier, but then in 2014, you interviewed Bob Adelman at length, and that's been published as a blog post. And it was called photographs that make a difference. So Jim is going to talk with us about Bob's career and work in relation to American social justice and documentary photography overall. Verna Curtis, she'll speak second, retired last year as a wonderful curator of photography in the Prints and Photographs division here at the Library of Congress. She found much common ground with Bob Adelman, not only through the exhibition March on Washington, co-curated with Marisha Battle, but also through Hometown Territory in Miami Beach, Florida. With more than 30 years of experience in the fields of both art and documentary photography, Verna is ideal to help us dive deeper into Bob's images and show how well they fit with some other collections at the Library of Congress. Our final speaker is Beattie, author of novels and short stories. I've read that she's been referred to as a pal of Bob's. We'll make that more formal, a long-standing and good friend. Sharers of philosophy and long conversations. And Anne is here today as one of Bob's close friends. She reportedly rejected Bob's request to photograph the people and places in her own stories, but has written about his amazing work with love and affection. Jim, you're up.
When I was asked, when I was asked to speak about Bob Adelman, my first thought was I didn't really know him that well. I'd met him a few times, and I've interviewed him twice. But upon reflection, I realized I did know him well, but that it was mainly through his photographs. His images affected me as a young child, looking at them in the pages of Life and Look magazines. They affected me as a young photographer, finding my own path in the field, and they continue to affect me today as a testament to what can happen when people stand up against injustice. Bob's photos were always honest and passionate. As a photographer, he wore his heart on his sleeve and always fought on the side of the angels. As a photojournalist, I have always wanted my images to affect the situations I document. But as I got older and images became more ubiquitous with the digital revolution, I've come to believe that there are few situations where a photo makes a difference that is measurable. Lewis Hines' photos of young children at work changed labor laws. Perhaps Nick Ute's Napalm Girl and Eddie Adams' photo of the Saigon execution helped galvanize opposition to the Vietnam War. I've made a few photos in my career that drew attention, but measurable change, not so much. We photojournalists risk our lives covering war, famine, and injustice, yet there is still as much war, famine, and injustice as when we start. So I've come to the conclusion that for me, it is enough that if I document those terrible things and people see them, at least they cannot say that they didn't know what was happening. And I'm okay with that. Most older photographers I have interviewed for the Lens blog bemoan the lack of effect that their photos have had. Don McCullen, whose images of war and famines were seen around the world, said to me flat out that he feels he wasted his life. But when I spoke with Bob Adelman, he said, of course photos change things. He noted that Gary Winograd, the street photographer, once famously said that photographs don't change things. Bob, who was in his 80s at the time, told me that was, and I quote, the silliest thing he had ever heard. Bob's photos and those of his fellow civil rights. Okay. Bob's photos and those of his fellow civil rights photographers clearly did help end the Jim Crow statutes. They helped change those laws by exposing the hideous nature of racial segregation and turning American opinion against it. He told Jet Magazine in 2014, in a profound sense, the movement realized how segregation was ugly and un-American. The photographs were the evidence. Bob's images were born out of an optimism and a belief that the American people, when confronted with the scope of racial injustices, would support the movement's goals. It's an optimism that Bob continued to display in his later work in Communities in Need. Bob was not just a documentarian of the civil rights movement. He was a passionate participant. He was a volunteer for CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was not an outsider. He won the trust of movement leaders, and that gave him a certain kind of access that resulted in a knowing insider view of the movement. His intimate images were instrumental in putting the message of equal rights for all forward at the time. Today, they're useful for understanding the complexities of what made the movement tick and how leaders presented themselves publicly. Helen Zinkham has tasked me with trying to describe Bob Adelman's importance in the photography world. Of course, he documented a critical period of American history in a comprehensive manner. But I think what really sets him apart is the respect that Bob had for his subjects. There were other white photographers who made important contributions to the documentation of the civil rights movement. But too many of them, though perhaps well-meaning, portrayed their subject as symbols of oppression, not as fully rounded human beings. Some photographers fetishized the Black Americans they were photographing, while others focused mainly on images of violence and Black bodies being violated. But in Bob's images, the people involved in the civil rights movement were treated with respect and portrayed in the most dignified manner, whether they were famous leaders or foot soldiers in the struggle. He approached everyone with equal respect, and this approach followed him throughout his illustrious career. This is what I noticed in his images when I studied them as a young photographer. And this is what influenced me profoundly. Like Bob, I strive to encounter all people on the same level, whether they're the richest and most powerful person or the poorest and most vulnerable. Encounter everyone on your level as equals. That's what I learned from Bob's work. Bob made the critically important historic photos of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. giving his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial, not far from where we sit today. Dr. King knew Bob and was comfortable with him. While most of the press were stuck in a faraway pen, Bob was able to get a close-up photo because everyone knew him, and everyone trusted him. Bob had a master's degree from Columbia in philosophy. I once asked him to tell me something I didn't know about Dr. King, since Bob had several opportunities to spend time with him. And apparently, between jokes, they discussed philosophy. Bob told me, and I quote, he was a personalist in his religious vocation. He believed that everyone was an aspect of God and that when he spoke to them, they deserved the attention and concern as if he were directly talking to God. While Bob was much, much less certain of the existence of God than Dr. King, his approach to the people he photographed echoed that sentiment. Look at the photo of Reverend Joseph Carter standing sentinel on his front porch, holding a rifle against a possible Ku Klux Klan ambush after he became the first Black resident of West Feliciana Parish in Louisiana to register to vote in 6 decades. Bob was also there later when a multitude of shots were fired through the house. This was just one of many times when Bob encountered violence and gunshots during the struggle for civil rights. He told me, I realized that my involvement would be very dangerous. But I had a long think with myself and decided that this was something worth risking your life for. In my last interview with him, he told me that he had found workable answers in his philosophy studies before turning to photography. I asked him what those answers were, because if he knew the meaning of life, I wanted to know it. He said that in the sense of the Middle Ages, he didn't think that there was any great focus to life, or that this world was a drama of salvation preparing us for the next life. He didn't think there was any overarching purpose to life, but that we were given meaning through families, experiences, affections we have, and values that we care deeply about. He said that funding projects would be meaningful in connection to those values, and that would be as much purpose as he could find. And I quote, "For me, if I got involved in something, it had to mean something. I had to see some purpose to it, and that it would be something I cared about." So Bob studied philosophy primarily to find his way in the world, but it was through photography that he discovered the meaning that he was searching for. He said, "I realized that I wanted to get involved in the world and make a difference." And he has. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena, and all of the library staff for their support for the Adelman acquisition and for organizing this lovely and significant occasion. I think it's appropriate to really look at Bob's career visually, so that's what I will bring to you this afternoon. In fact, you may be seeing his images in many places and not even be aware of it. Are we going here? Don't see it here. Oops. This is a poster for Raoul Peck's recent Academy Award nominated film about writer James Baldwin, I Am Not Your Negro. Baldwin's penetrating eyes come from one of Bob's photos. Bob got to know him during the civil rights movement and photographed him during the run of his play, Blues for Mr. Charlie. If you haven't seen Peck's film, it is, in fact, like the author's eyes. It delves into the essence of the man and does this in a very creative way. Peck uncovered an unpublished manuscript of Baldwin's and uses those words to probe his life and times, offering an unusual authenticity. The quality of authenticity also distinguishes Bob's work and makes it so very appropriate for the library's photographic collections. Bob came to the attention of the library staff about 10 years ago when he arrived to examine, potentially for a book project, negatives made by Ralph Ellison. Ellison's archive is in the manuscripts division, and his relatively unknown photographic work resides in the prints and photographs division. My colleague Marisha Battle met Bob and subsequently visited him to acquire a selection of civil rights photographs. And one of them was this iconic image we've been looking at of Dr. King. We organized a photographic exhibition commemorating the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington in August 2013, and the following January held a symposium with some of the photographers who had witnessed the march. Bob was one of the stars who spoke, and subsequently was invited to give several lectures about his work at the library. He was asked, in effect, to take on a role of photographer in residence in the hope that someday such a position might officially be designated. Here is an energized Bob doing his civil rights work in the 1960s. In the movement, he found that cause that Jim just mentioned. He saw others give their lives, and he felt he could die for the same cause. He's both a cameraman, one of his photographs ran on the cover of Newsweek, and a participant at the Selma March in the spring of 1965. You've already seen his most famous photograph in Birmingham, spring 1963, and he was there, and he witnessed how the students wouldn't run away, holding on to each other for dear life. Bob's teacher, Alexei Brodovich, claimed this image, quote, seared itself into his memory. Bob did not have much formal training in photography. His real introduction was through his father, who was a serious amateur with a darkroom at home. Bob attended Manhattan's Stuyvesant High School and then Rutgers. For a master's degree at Columbia, he majored in philosophy, as we've heard, focusing on aesthetics, and continued studying about art. He spent a year in law school at Harvard, but returned to New York City and began talking his way into photographer studios. Eventually, in 1959, he enrolled in Brodovich's famous design laboratory at the New School for Social Research. For an assignment to shoot in Times Square, Bob settled on something different. He took a graphic look down upon a group of sailors from the Hotel Astor. For assignment to photograph an egg, Bob researched what Edward Steichen had done with the subject and then tried everything, persevering until he could find something that would be uniquely his own, this image of a crumpled, hard-cooked egg. Bob believed that besides qualities of design, his activities in photography needed to have purpose. And the purpose, he found, was to fight for equal rights, support justice, and help make change in people's lives for the better. He first got involved with the Brooklyn Congress of Racial Equality and became their national photographer. Brooklyn was where CORE began the freedom rides. As you can see, people there were picketing for education as well as a livable community and economic opportunity, themes that Bob would later expand upon. Through the civil rights movement, Bob met many great people, Baldwin, the political thinker, Michael Harrington, but he was closeness he felt to Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was such that Bob always referred to him as Doc. He attended King's funeral in 1968 and took intimate photographs of the family, which have a permanent place in the National King Historic Site in Atlanta. Bob's magazine work, beginning in the mid-1960s, often dovetailed with his civil rights photography, which concerned voter drives in the South, as on the left, of a man registering in Sumter, South Carolina. For Ebony, he followed the Reverend Joe Carter, the first black man to register and vote in West Feliciana, Louisiana. And in fact, I think he told you, Jim, that this was the most dangerous situation he had ever faced. Bob was awarded a Guggenheim Foundation grant in 1964. And here are two examples of that work. His proposal was to, quote, continue his work on the efforts of Negroes to achieve equality in America and to begin a study of poverty in the context of contemporary affluence. His application was supported by Edward Steichen, who lauded the valuable project, and Bob as a serious thinker. His teacher, Brodovich, pointed to Bob's integrity and courage and the vitality and necessity of the project. Dorothy Norman, Alfred Stieglitz's future biographer, concurred that Bob was, quote, dedicated and selfless, a person of integrity, and shows promise as one of the most effective photographers of the American social scene, end quote. On assignment, Bob was unafraid and a charmer with a gift for repartee. His editorial work for numerous magazines included, we've already heard, Look, Life, New York Times Magazine, too many to cite. The assignments were very varied, and these are from a story about the daily life of Sumter, South Carolina Sheriff J. Bird Parnell. Bob documented this drug raid in New York. It was for Look. He met and photographed many people, such as Sidney Poitier, B.B. King, Miles Davis, Tina Turner. One of the crowds he most enjoyed hanging out with were the pop artists, James Rosenquist, Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, and others, being represented by art gallery dealer Leo Castelli. For a magazine article, Bob cleverly decided to take Andy Warhol grocery shopping. Roy Lichtenstein became a close friend. Bob's love for art comes through here in this portrait in which the artist has been positioned as a sculpture base below his own representation of Brancusi's 1910 Sleeping Muse. Bob was a prolific producer of more than 60 books, as well as many bookazines, continuing after he moved from New York to Miami Beach. Some were his own, others were with and for other people. This collage gives you an idea of the range of these many book projects, some unusual, as in the lower right, even bawdy, as Tijuana Bibles on the lower right, the book about the ribald underground comics as a form of folk art. Bob and the influential cartoonist and editor Art Spiegelman worked on it together. Next to that book cover is his project about the Bill of Rights with the head of the American Civil Liberties Union, Ira Glasser, who's here today, called Visions of Liberty. Never far from Bob's mind was concern for equality and education and about poverty, which eluded people from those American values. Here is an example of the graphically artful layout that characterizes Bob's book projects. An assignment looking at children growing up without their fathers led in the 1970s to a series of small books for and about children, some elevating play and many finding a way to improve reading skills. Down Home, photographed from 1965 to 1970 and published in 1971, was Bob's first major book project. It is a sociological study of people living in Camden, Alabama. Bob continued photographing the same people for over 30 years. He intended to publish Home again, but it became an unfinished project. Two of the young folks Bob met in 1965 are shown on the book pages on the left, and on the right is how he found those same two girls 10 years later. Bob was looking for positive results from the kind of civil rights actions he had participated in. In general, he was a keen observer of process. There would be more of this kind of photography. The betterment of America was Bob's focus. The Next America in 1974 was a project Bob did with Michael Harrington, whom he had met through his earlier work with CORE. Harrington had written The Other America, which had had an impact on the Kennedy administration. This time, he and Bob would update that book with the decline and rise of the United States. Bob was always showing America how he saw it, and then attempting to do something about making life in America better. He was putting his photographs to use for social causes. How the Other Half Still Lives was a petition to President Carter to pay attention to the South Bronx, done under the auspices of the Phelps-Stokes Foundation. The library borrowed a rare copy of these photographs for its recent exhibition highlighting the muckraking journalism of Jacob Riis. Riis's original How the Other Half Lives gave voice to the New York City tenements of the 1880s. You can see that Bob was all about America. Here's a glance at the great American pastime. Bob's study of the Pittsburgh Pirates was during the season following the death of Roberto Clemente, who was killed in a plane crash in 1972. It featured their all-star player and left fielder Willie Stargell during the 1973 season. As you can see, Bob got into the game himself. Bob's own involvement in things is most clearly seen in The Diet, which examined obesity. He produced photographs on this subject for Esquire and the London Sunday Times in 1979 to 80. He took on an experimental diet himself. He exercised and under doctor's care lost 100 pounds in a year. Bob relished the outcome and was never more proud of anything than this composite group of photographs he made of himself. As you can see, Bob liked to observe process. He followed how artists work. With close friend Roy Lichtenstein, he was on set as the artist applied color, outline, and dot matrices for a mural-sized view of an iconic Oval Office. Bob delighted in watching the artist work. Carver Country, produced in 1990, is a unique visual biography of the short story writer Raymond Carver. Carver's letters and poems provide the text, and Bob's photographs help us match those gritty words with images of the bleak, blue-collar towns of the author's native Pacific Northwest. I'd say that Visions of Liberty from the early 1990s summarizes what Bob stood for and the body of photographs he left us. Native American children in the Southwest, a women's march in New York City, a protester at an anti-Vietnam War rally, a family supporting gay rights. One of Bob's most popular images is this one, taken at the People's Wall in the IBM Pavilion at the World's Fair in Queens in 1964. It has been interpreted as a statement about race and class in America. Actually, this image reveals, Bob's delight in technology and humanity. He has manipulated his camera so as to flatten the seating for a ride that actually was on an incline. The people appear wary or excited as they are about to be sucked up into an ovoid multi-screen theater designed by Charles Eames in order to view a film about design in the technological age. Bob's career epitomizes what Ralph Ellison said about his work. Quote, "It moves into the rare sphere wherein technical ability and social vision combine to create a work of art." His archive now joins forces with the Library of Congress's great collections, which preserve the contributions to our society of Ellison, leaders of the civil rights movement, and the designers Charles and Ray Eames, among so many other American creators. His work will continue to have a place in American history alongside his heroes and ours. We can just imagine that the ever-smiling, serious, wild, devilish Bob would be joyful now.
Those were really wonderful talks. I was sitting here so lost, I forgot that I had to get up third. Yes, Bob. Well, Bob and I met in New York City, I believe in 1981. I was living there with my dog, and I didn't know Bob's work, but I certainly did know his images. And when I got to know Bob, I got to know his work very well indeed. But he came to photograph me for the cover of a magazine that folded over the weekend. So it was a wonderful cover shot. I can still see it. Would that I could have brought it today, but that's something I've lost track of. But that's really how we got to be friends. And then after New York City, when our lives went different places, we were just never out of touch. We did still sometimes work together. When I first met Bob, we worked together a bit more because he was always kind enough to have me be the, the sudden feigned epiphany of, oh, I know who should do this assignment with me. The writer should be, long pause, and then it got so the editors would fill it in, say, right, Anne, yeah. Send Anne again. But then I married my husband, and my husband sort of became the unofficial driver for all these adventures. Bob was the photographer, I was the writer. One of the things that really interested me about Bob was that, yeah, I'm a writer, and you can't be that, I think, without having a somewhat visual sense of the world, even if your tools are words. But if Bob and I did the same thing of an evening, and if it was just the most ordinary kind of thing, just going to a diner, getting a bite to eat or something, I would sometimes say to him, wow, did you see that, that sort of Baroque cherub that was up there, above the wainscoting? And he'd say, yeah. And I'd say, oh, because it was over your back shoulder. He'd say, yeah, and I saw it when I walked in, and there was another one on the bottom right. Okay. Then he'd say to me, did you hear that discussion about the people who were breaking up? And I'd say, no. And then he would narrate all of that for me, too. So, it does make sense in a way, because he was very much known and very hugely talented, obviously, as a documentary photographer. But his interest was in watching things elapse in time. And if you were with him personally, this is merely anecdotal, but you would get no response. I mean, it was almost like he was holding the cards close to the vest, because he didn't want to say anything that might in some way take away from it as a potential image or as what it was to him. And writers know this too, you can talk something away. I mean, that's the way we talk about it sometimes. That's why writers don't necessarily like to paraphrase their work, because you feel like, well, okay, is that all I wrote? Or I've just given you the highlights of that plot. But he was an enigma to me, certainly. He was, as we know. I'm just curious to know, how many of you in the audience, in one way or another, professionally or personally, how many people here actually knew Bob? Oh, like lots of people. Yeah, okay. Well, it is a big group, but that's very interesting. I think the thing that I would say to somebody who didn't know Bob, though, was what is abundantly clear in the work anyway, but still maybe should be remarked upon, and that is how really hard he worked. I mean, if my husband and I were visiting Bob, and I got up to go to the bathroom at 4 o'clock in the morning, the computer screen was glowing, he was sending something somewhere, and he was up before us in the morning and after us at night, and that was just around the house. That was just with keeping up with a lot of the work that he had to do with his wonderful assistant. But, just the sheer vigor and the amount of energy that Bob expended was absolutely amazing, because he certainly could have rested on his laurels at some point. He could have said, please come to my studio for me to make a portrait of you, Dr. King. No kidding. I mean, it wouldn't matter how famous you were. That is what a lot of photographers do, and perhaps do well and get what they want out of those things. But Bob always wanted chance to be the thing that intervened, and that's not so likely to happen if you're set up in your studio. I mean, somewhat, but certainly not like being in Birmingham. Come on. That's just a very different matter. But I think it was always that reflexive need that Bob had to be surprised, whether for the better or for worse, that really got him out on the street so many times, when he wasn't just doing the things that we all have to do to follow through on the things that we've gotten in the scene or registered in our minds at the moment. So he was really among many hardworking people I've known, I'm sure we all have, he was really one of the most hardworking, and always with such a sense of generosity and sincerity about him too. He, of course, had his own cosmos, and we talked to each other in shorthand, or we just went like that to the other because we were so sick of the other's differing opinions, or whatever we did. But if you heard about Samantha, it didn't need to be said that my daughter Samantha. If you heard about John, there was only one John in the universe. That was Lowengaard. If you heard about Ira, you knew perfectly well it was Ira Glaser. I mean, these people were always in the back of Bob's mind, though, and I think that is a thing that's true of artists, visual artists in any medium, is that, you know, they really do want to think of themselves too as bolstered by and contextualized by their peers or their betters, as he felt about Brodovich. And so, you know, that was an important thing for Bob too. I do want to say, though, that it seemed to me, I don't know if this will ring a bell or not with those of you who knew him, but it took me a long time to just realize a simple truth about Bob, which is that he was one of those guys who would always keep you waiting. He could wear 10 wristwatches and, you know, a stopwatch around his neck, and he was always late. He never could get out of the house in time. I mean, maybe he didn't even get out of the house the whole day when you were waiting at the front door. But it took me a long time to realize that professionally he was up for anything, you know. Okay, a meteor is coming down in the middle of this protest march. What do I photograph, you know? He absolutely wanted that. He wanted that intrusion of the real world in a lot of ways. But personally speaking, I think the way he tried to keep a handle on things, maybe, you know, a very stern kind of grip that he had, was that he would not be made to conform to the clock. He would not be made to get going, even if he might miss what he needed to get to. He hated transitions. I just realized that very recently, that he would do almost anything, including look bad, get yelled at, because he simply didn't want to tolerate transitions. And I don't just say that anecdotally, I say it in terms of, you know, the things that we all do that maybe we're not so aware of, or that are maybe not quite as easy to discern as that about Bob. But we all have these things that we do to give us a little handle on the world and to feel like, yeah, things are always complicated, but we have to watch ourselves. We have to, you know, we have to be mindful. And he was all of those things in his work. When he got there, you couldn't pry him out either. But to get Bob out the front door, if you had better luck than I did, here's to you. You know, he was really world league with that. The other thing I do want to say, though, that I think transcends being just an anecdote, because I was thinking, what will I say? I did spend so much time with him under so many different circumstances. But one time I was the writer and Bob the photographer, of course, and we went out to photograph, you all know the famous painting, American Gothic, Grant Wood's painting. And we went out to Eldon, Iowa. I can't even remember, though, it was the 100th anniversary of it being painted or something like that. But it was some impressive occasion, and Life was documenting this. And we went out there, and Bob decided that what would be very amusing would be to have the real house in the background and then a photograph of the house, and he needed somebody to hold this photograph of the house for him. Well, not at street level. That wasn't what he wanted at all. He wanted it from up high, but we were in Eldon, Iowa, about as flat as this floor. And so no problem whatsoever. So Bob says, come on, and climbs up on the rental car, huge rental car with his tripod and all these cameras and everything. And he's standing there in the middle of the car, and I said, come up there. And he reaches down. Okay, great. So I'm standing up there on top of the car, and he's got me holding a photograph he's already taken of the house like this, and I'm holding it with my hand. And he says, could you put your fingers, more? So I'm really kind of holding it really out as much in the margins as I possibly can. And I suddenly hear, Bob has gone down about this much in the car. He and the tripod, not that he ever comes out from behind it, he just goes like this. And I said, Bob, and I'm standing up there too. Okay, that's not my anecdote. That's just another day's work with Bob. However, it turned out that I was leaving Iowa 2 days before Bob was. And he said, okay, so, the Life crew can give me a ride to the airport, but you just return the rental car, okay? And I said, well, Bob, I mean, well, what am I going to say? And he said, oh, it's a rental car. You know, this is a direct quote. It's a rental car. You just do your best. And I said, well, but I mean, just give me my lines here. I drive the car in, and he said, oh, no, they're not even going to notice. They don't look, you know, they look at the odometer. They look at, did you leave anything in the trunk, you know? And he had he could be so convincing that sometimes I really wanted to believe it and did believe it, so I drive the car in, and people look as the car is coming into the lot. You know, it's like, the car comes into the lot, the roof is like this, and the guy says, what happened? And I said, what happened with what? And he said, the roof? And I went, I said, I don't know. And he said, want to take a guess? And I said, a meteor? I did. And then, of course, it all turned out all right, at least for me, because Bob would just say, oh, it's working for, the magazine. They understand you have these sort of setbacks on assignment. You just do the best you can. So he was really an artist. He was not just out there flummoxing, believe me. He was really doing the best he could, and we've seen such absolutely amazing things today. Just to leave you with one very brief quote, because Bob was so modest that if anyone complimented him or anything like that, you would never hear about it. But in the famous photograph of Birmingham with the fire hose, with the fire hydrants open and the hoses trained on the people and so forth, what Bob said about that day was there was as much water behind the camera as there was in front of it. And it's just an amazing photograph. And he hung in there too to get that. They weren't letting him just stand there like they didn't see that he was there, Very, very brave person as well. So he got that wonderful photograph, and then, which I didn't know until fairly recently, he printed it up fairly quickly and gave it to Dr. Martin Luther King. And he said about that photograph, I'm startled that out of so much pain, some beauty came. So when you say, does it do any social good? Does it not? We're all, I'm sure, from time to time, if not constantly, tortured by that and what we're doing. You don't have to be an artist to be tortured by that. Will what I do, really matter? But I think it was certain comments like that were tremendously encouraging to Bob and really just right on as far as I'm concerned. So, thank you.
All right. We have some time for question answer, or if you would like to have a mic and add a memory of Bob to our webcast, we'd be very pleased to hear from you. While the hand mics come around, I would like to acknowledge Sam Ray. Please stand up. This is Bob Adelman's daughter. And I believe we have sisters and grandchildren and other family members. Would you mind standing briefly? This is in part so that as you converse during the reception, you'll know who's who. The beautiful display of Bob's photographs is brought to us by Stephen Watt. And I think with that beginning, does anyone have a question, either for our panelist or Stephen or family members? What else would you like to know about Mr. Adelman? Yes?
I want to tell you a brief story.
Okay, then please wait for the hand mic, and that way it can be for everyone to hear about it.
My name is Richard Milner. I met Bob on a talk show. We were both speaking about books we had just written that came out. It was in 1971. I had done a book on black pimps and their white women, and it was called Black Players, The Secret World of Black Pimps. And Bob had done a book called Gentlemen of Leisure, which was a bestseller. And Bob's book sold much better than mine. First of all, mine was more academic, and secondly, it had no pictures. And when and when I suggested to the publisher, Little Brown, that we should have some photographs, and we asked around. Everybody told us it was absolutely impossible to do a photo essay on black pimps and their women. It was a closed, secret world, and you didn't get into that world. Well, of course, one man did get into that world, Bob, and he did a fantastic photo essay of a man called Silky and his women. It was an incredible, intimate look. The world of, well, Bob and I were both sort of trying not only to understand across the racial divide the fine people like Dr. King, but also the ordinary people, like the ones you see in the marches, and even maybe the bad people, because a rounded view of human beings, to Bob and my sensibilities, required that. When I was in the graduate school, they were sending my fellow graduate school students all over the world in New Guinea villages and everything, and they didn't know what was happening down the block. They didn't know, and they couldn't speak the language, which is now, by the way, incorporated into American English. What is a bitch, a hoe, all this. It's now hip-hop language. But at that time, it was black hustler language, and I wrote a dictionary of it, and Bob and Susan Hall wrote a dictionary of it in his book. And one of the things that pleased me so much was that when I was doing mine, I had absolutely no idea if I was getting it right. And were the people I was interviewing giving me information that had a broader context. And Bob had the same concerns. And when we met and compared notes, and we found that he, working in two completely opposite sides of the country, had found sociologically, psychologically, humanistically, we were looking at the same thing, and we were looking at the same slang language, and we sort of confirmed each other, and we were reviewed together in Newsweek and other places. So we appeared on a talk show.
So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That adds another aspect of interest in people from all backgrounds and lives.
Yeah.
And ask if there's another question. Yeah.
If I may, I want to tell you one other brief story. Years later, and I kept up with Bob very, very closely over the years. And one day I was doing a story on the circus for Esquire, which never got published for various reasons. But now that the circus is closing, I'm going to try it again. Because I interviewed Gunther Gebel-Williams, the greatest animal trainer in the world, who had tigers and elephants and everything else. And I got access to the circus through the press pass of Esquire. And on the last day, when I was well known there at the circus, I said, Bob, would you like to come down with me on the last day and photograph? Oh, he said, I always wanted to do a circus story. Sure, I'll be there. So he shows up. The Ringling Circus was at the Madison Square Garden. And as we walked in, a parade of elephants came right in front of us, blocking us. Bob walks up to the elephants and starts punching them in the ass. Get out of the way! Get out of the way! Press! Press! I said, Bob, you're punching the elephants. He said, well, they're in my way. They're in my way. When Bob focused on getting a story, he could be very, very rough and aggressive, let me tell you, and nothing stood in his way. When we got into the center ring, Gunther had his trained tigers, and they came up to us and they said to Bob, now, we're going to let you photograph from in here, which we never do, but I want to tell you one thing. Do not go right up to the cage and put your lens through the bars, because the tigers will, you could get killed that way. Don't stand back and you know, do what you can with your long lenses and so on. So we did that for a few minutes, and Bob turned to me and said, this is impossible. I'm not photographing this from back here. The bars are in the way. And without hesitation, he went right up to the tiger cage, stuck his lens through the bars with his cheek right next to it, and I suddenly realized that Bob, when he was looking through a camera lens, he disappeared to himself. He was the camera. He couldn't get hurt. That's how he did the marches with the water and everything else and the dogs. He didn't feel personal danger. He was his camera. And that's all that mattered. Now I'm going to get emotional. So he got the pictures. I still have them somewhere when they were never published. But
I think you may have given us a perfect, almost an ending line. Bob Adelman
well,
was his camera.
then let me lend it there, and let me say one other thing. Bob had a reputation for cantankerousness, and he could be very rough, and he could be very disputatious, and we had our disagreements. But to me personally, and I think to many people in this room, he was the kindest, most generous person who extended his hand to an unknown writer and treated me as if I were Jim B. Baldwin or anybody else.
Yeah, we will miss him very much, wouldn't you say? That's for all of us today. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I mean, we think we have come to a great moment where I'll invite you to the reception food. We've laid out many of the books that Bob authored or photographed, as well as books he produced. And after you've enjoyed some good company, the beautiful photographs at the other end of the room. So please, have a wonderful conversation. Thank you.